Well, we think it's really important to have the quality of experience and knowledge around borrowings and also the disciplines around that. Certainly, as someone who was a minister who had to deal with big projects, it was really clear that sometimes we had to get in expertise from sometimes offshore in order to be able to put some more grunt into the decision making around contracts and also how to deliver on them. But I think too, Andrew, you might want to add a little bit to that because of your experience in financing as well. Why bring them together?
Yeah, I think most people just assume that financing is pretty simple, that you're just going to go and issue treasury bonds or whatever. This bank will have an important role in terms of assessing projects, working out how best to finance them, because they won't always just be funded traditionally using government bond type borrowing program, making sure they're packaged up and then how you get investors involved in it, whether it's equity or debt investment. And so that's a really crucial part of funding projects. And that's the bit everyone seems to forget about. That's probably the most important bit. Once you've framed it up, once you've got the investment package ready, then it's easier to go and actually source that financing, whether it's debt or equity, either domestically or offshore. So that's a crucial role.
Andrew, investors are going to want a return
Yep.
on what they put in there. Why then are you going to the private sector for that money when the government as a whole can borrow a hell of a lot cheaper?
Well, there are projects that should be funded by the government, and obviously the government can borrow very cheaply at the moment. But there are other projects that is quite reasonable and better, in fact, that you get third-party investment in it. Why should the government borrow and fund everything? That is an approach that just blows our debt ratios, all those sorts of things out of the water. So we've got good projects that people want to invest in, and we've got pension funds not only in New Zealand, superannuation, New Zealand Kiwi fund providers, whatever, but we've got people overseas who are looking for good investments if they're well structured and they offer a return. And that is where we are basically saying, as a government, we don't need to go and get that financing. We can actually get someone else to help fund that financing.
Can you give us an example of the kind of projects that would be attractive, say, to an overseas investor?
Well, I think there's lots. We've got housing projects. We had the community housing question just before. If in terms of expanding the housing market, we work alongside community housing providers who may have some equity, who want to have a foot in the game, who also want to manage those housing assets over time. They could be for providing money as well as pension funds. We've seen it with roading projects, of course, where people want to invest in roading projects. Where there's good types of assets that pension funds who are looking for a long-term investment, reasonable return, at the moment most of them are getting very poor returns, particularly if they're invested in government-type debt. They are looking for good types of returns. They will put their money up, and that means the government doesn't have to put their money up.
Would you see a role for the local government finance agency in this? Why would you roll that up into this?
Well, we're not proposing to roll the local government financing agency up. It plays an important role, but as you will be aware, principally what they're doing is working, going out and getting bond-type debt funding for the councils and working well within the council arena. What this group will do is that another leg. It's actually a government agency, and there will be times when, for instance, there are multiple investments like in water as an example, that there may be an opportunity for third-party people to be involved in that, or it may be that government is putting money into it. And if we are, and I'm not suggesting we might, but if we were to do that, we might co-invest. All that type of structuring, that type of investment analysis, and then actually sourcing the debt or the equity that goes alongside it, this is where that expertise would reside in this bank. So we're not saying to LGFA, you're not going to have a role anymore. There is, of course, a role for it, but this is a very specialised organisation.
Can we ask? I just wonder whether you could clarify your comments on Air New Zealand. You said you wouldn't be purist about any future equity into the company. Does that mean that you would see that extra equity coming from the government, or if it was to come from the private sector, why would they invest when it's losing heaps?
When I was talking about being, wouldn't always be purist, it's in terms of letting a business like Air New Zealand fail. I certainly would not want to see that happen, because clearly we are a very isolated country. We know at the moment that airlines around the world are going through very difficult times, and we've also seen a lot of airlines pull out of New Zealand. It is really important that we believe, though, that we have the disciplines that being publicly owned in terms of public money, private money going into Air New Zealand is important. So that's what I was saying, is that we wouldn't just let that fail. It's too important for New Zealand.
But where would any additional equity come from?
Oh, well, look,
We've been talking about this.
yeah, look, there's plenty of international interest in investing in airlines all around the world, and so there's an opportunity for either debt or equity. The only point we were making is that there's been a suggestion out there that the government might want to take it over entirely, and we wouldn't agree with that, because we think it's absolutely right that we continue with what has been a very successful arrangement of the private sector disciplines and working with that party, and not having it run by Shane Jones and Grant Robertson. And so we think it's a very successful was a very successful company before these extraordinary events, and we'd want to be able to see that party to continue to raise funds internationally.
Judith, can I ask you what you make of Labor's new tax policy that they announced today? 39 cents above 180k, what do you make of it?
Well, I think it's just the start, isn't it? We've seen Grant Robertson today rule out any tax cuts, but he sounded, when I heard the press conference, incapable of ruling out any more tax grabs. And certainly we know that the Greens, who are bosom buddies with Labor on these issues, have made it very clear that they'd like a wealth tax. I don't know what else they want to tax. Probably if you die, they want to tax you too. So what we haven't heard is him being able to rule out any of those other taxes. What he said is that they're around a coalition table. Essentially, everything's up for grabs. So I'd say, why is he so quick to rule out any tax cuts and so slow to rule out any tax increases?
Do you think middle income earners should be worried?
I think it's just the start, and that's what we've seen. What we don't do as a country is tax our way out of a recession. It's really important that we have money circulating the economy, and that money is being spent on things in New Zealand and for New Zealand. I just think that it's a very short-term measure.
Can you rule out introducing any new taxes?
Yes, I can.
So how will you pay for your election promises?
Well, as you know, we have our full fiscal plan coming forward, and that will be released post the preview, and I think that's the right time for that.
Just on the infrastructure bank, back to that, overseas, these have been associated both with, funneling debt at relatively cheap interest rates to different infrastructure projects, and with, I guess, crowding in private investment for these projects. On what end do you see this bank fitting? Do you see it doing both equally, or do you see it, trying to encourage more crowding in of private investment?
I think that's an Andrew one. We've got so many people I can choose from in this.
Well, actually, we're trying to allow a mechanism for large-scale investment by pension funds, as an example I've given you, to create the opportunity that if they wanted to invest in New Zealand, they have the opportunity to do it. But to do that, you need to structure these investments in a way that's attractive to them. So it's a way of opening up alternative sources of capital, both debt and equity. And we can talk about social bonds, we can talk about infrastructure bonds, we can talk about a whole range of green bonds or the other ones. So if we were in moving down over time, and we were looking at bringing in different classes of investors, whether debt or equity, but investors coming in to invest in New Zealand, the way you structure that debt, the way you present it to people, that is the finessing skill that this bank will have. And so we welcome that type of investment in the right situations.
How could the private sector, in terms of the return it would demand, ever do better than 0.6% on a 10-year bond?
But it's not just about the financing of it. These things often bring with it people bring in other skills and other capabilities to the investment. So if you're saying, right, it's just an outright debt funding of it, of course the government can fund that the most appropriately and cheapest way. But if the investors bring in other skills or capability, then that should be welcomed. In this situation, like we talked about community housing providers. Community housing providers don't just offer debt, although they're a limited amount, they bring other skills to the party. And that's when you mix this all up and you get the best type of investment for the particular asset you're talking about. So this is not just a funding thing. Otherwise we could just go and keep borrowing in the markets. That's the lack of sophistication we have at the moment.
The Prime Minister's in Whakatane visiting first responders in Whakaari, a prime ministerial trip. Is that appropriate on the campaign?
Well, I think so, actually. I don't mind that at all. I think that there should be a royal commission into what happened at White Island. I think it needs to have that level of oversight. And I think that people probably would be very grateful if the Prime Minister announced that. Certainly if I am fortunate enough to be the next Prime Minister, I will certainly announce that if it's not done before then.
Have the crises of this first term helped Jacinda Ardern get votes?
Well, it's not for me to say, really. I think New Zealanders are significantly more sophisticated than that. And I think that what we often do is that we could focus on that, but I'm not focusing on that. I'm focusing on the things that really matter about actually having a better future for New Zealand. We're in a time of economic crisis. 160 years apparently is the last time we had an economic crisis of this magnitude coming at us. We have the wage subsidy about to end. We have tremendous amounts of borrowing going on. I actually think New Zealanders just want us to get on with the job, and that's what I'm prepared to do.
Why the royal commission into the Whakaari eruption is the WorkSafe investigation that's underway at the moment not good enough?
Well, it certainly wasn't good enough for the Pike River investigation. I think this is a magnitude, a huge, it's a big magnitude when it comes to just how unsafe that, obviously, that worksite was. I think it deserves it. It is a huge loss of people and massive injuries to others whose lives were saved. I think there should be one into it. I think it's something that New Zealanders would want to see.
Jacinda said today that your response to their tax policy, hey, this is just the start. She described it as misinformation and said this is just opposition politics. What would you say to that?
Well, I've heard quite a lot from her finance spokesperson, Mr. Grant Robertson, which I'd have to say characterises misinformation and basically enormous speculation. Let's say he's been courageous in his assumptions. That's the kindest way of putting it. It's outright nonsense. So, look, it's just a bit of politicking from Grant Robertson that we've been hearing today. But I'd say to Jacinda Ardern, stick to the facts, stick to the issues, and I think people will be more impressed by that.
Just on Robertson's comments, I mean, he said, what I'm saying is that this policy that Labour is campaigning on will be the only changes that we implement. You know, is that not ruling it out?
No, it's not. As we've seen, he also said that they were going to deliver on things like child poverty, Kiwi Build, and just about everything else they promised. But no.
When he says that they're not going to add any other taxes, and you say the same, you know, why is his word not as good as yours?
Oh, because we have a track record of actually saying what we do. He's also made it very clear in the stand-up that I heard that the Green Party's policies were theirs. As we've seen from Labour, is a lot of stuff is on the table when it comes to coalition talks, and I would say to people is that this will just be the start. It is really important that when we've seen a government that has displayed, let's say, a foolhardy regard to other people's money and making promises, that we are right to question those. It is simply not acceptable to just take as gospel what Mr. Robertson's saying.
Just on the Royal Commission for Whakaari, can you understand why Jacinda Ardern might want to wait until the answers come back from the WorkSafe inquiry so as not to double up by launching a Royal Commission now?
Well, she may wish to do that, but I think she needs to tell the people involved and the families why that is.
So you would want her to launch a Royal Commission, let's say, I'm going to do a Royal Commission, but we're going to do it in 6 months now.
Well, I think people want answers. They want answers as to how this was able to happen, and they also want answers about the responses to it. But what is really clear is that people have said to me from that particular area that they would like to know the answers, and they are very concerned that there may not be as robust an investigation as they would expect. Certainly we found the Royal Commission for Pike River actually had all the answers, and still we had the then opposition parties, now in government, allocating up to $50 million to do this, to find out the same things that the Royal Commission did. I see no problem with the Royal Commission on this. I think it needs to happen.
Is there enough resource to launch a third Royal Commission? We've got 2 underway at the moment and both have been extended because of COVID-19. Is there enough resource, funding and staff who could actually work on a Royal Commission?
Well, that's a matter for the government to answer, isn't it?
What did you make of the government announcing just before that they're going to set up a new border exemption category that would allow more workers, people with work visas to come back to the country?
Well, it'd be really good if I had any confidence in the government's ability to keep COVID-19 out of the country. And what would be, when I saw that, I thought, well, we've been asking for people for various situations and essential industries, absolutely crucial workers, to be able to be allowed back into New Zealand, but only if they can be done. That can be done so on the basis of a safety first, and that needs to happen. The issue is really. Is that there's no single border protection agency. The testing that we've been promised is happening isn't necessarily happening. We were hearing just the other day that instead of the many thousands of port-facing workers who should have been tested, we had a few hundred that have been tested. Actually, I think we still don't have any confidence in it, and that's one of the problems.
And it doesn't sound like this policy would catch seasonal workers either, right? And then get back into helping out with agriculture and stuff. Does that concern you?
Well, I think any policy needs to be about how, and that's why the opening the economy is very, very important around having a secure border. I don't think that the government has any chance of doing this in a systematic and sensible way or at any volume unless they have a single border protection agency, as we have promoted, as has been done in Taiwan. It is really important that we get this right. We are one of the most isolated countries in the world. As we've found, it's very easy to shut down our borders. It's very hard to let people through without bringing in COVID-19, particularly with a government that is absolutely against testing people before they put them on a plane.
Elect Corporate UMR poll out today has National on 29%. Is it over for you and National this election?
Well, I understand that's the Labour Party's pollsters fancy that. No, I don't think so. What I'd also say is just always understand there's only one poll that matters, that's election day. And as we found for Scott Morrison, Boris Johnson, Brexit, pretty much the pollsters are normally wrong.
If you get as low as that on October 17, would you stand down as leader?
Oh, that won't be happening. Thank you.
A Bill report estimates a potential $1 billion tax take on cannabis, potentially 5,000 jobs created.
Right.
Is that a compelling argument?
Okay, I'm really pleased you asked about that, actually. That Bill report also said that there would be, was it 400 cannabis shops they felt in the country. Oh, well, that's hardly good news for Northland or the Eastern Bay, where I've been the last couple of days. The other thing that it also said is that when it looked at overseas jurisdictions that had legalised the recreational use and sale of cannabis, that they'd ended up with about double. It was about double the number of people using cannabis than they had before. I don't think this is a good thing. I think really people do need to think about mental health in particular, and particularly the messages that we're sending to younger people who are often quite vulnerable when it comes to decision making. So yeah, no, I don't think it's a good thing. I thought it was staggering that the government wanted to hide this this report from Bill about those number of cannabis shops. And I think too that's really interesting is I don't understand why the Prime Minister can't tell us where she's voting on this, because she can tell us where she's voting on the other referendum but not this one. I can tell you I'm voting against the legalisation of sale and use of for recreational use of cannabis. I'd like the Prime Minister to front up and answer that one.
An estimated 5,000 jobs created though, isn't that the kind of job creation we need at the moment?
No, I don't think so. A lot of that I think will be in all sorts of areas that would rather not. I think it's really important to think about the social, mental harm, physical harm that can occur from the early use of cannabis in any quantities. I actually think there's a lot more to be said about this. And if the Prime Minister thinks it's such a good idea, maybe she'd like to tell us where she's going to vote, because I'm voting against. I don't know why she can't tell us.
So it makes sense, do you think, for it to remain illegal, given a lot of the people standing next to you, your colleagues, you know, openly admitted they've smoked cannabis?
Well, of course, I haven't. And secondly, they've also admitted that they will be voting against it, because there's one thing to try something and then there's another thing to decide, actually, you don't think it's something that should be legal in the community.
Is the National Party chaotic and desperate?
Oh, dear, oh dear. Is this the standard we've got for the Finance Minister, is it? Is that him? Yeah, okay.
Should just
Is Grant Robertson right when he says your debt target will require $80 billion of cuts?
No.
It's misinformation.
Misinformation, let me say. Misinformation from Mr Robertson again. And, you know, for a completely incompetent government that hasn't been able to deliver on almost anything they've promised, I actually think it's a bit rich. Misinformation and incompetent. It's a government that I've got to say is very dodgy with what it says and even dodgy with what it does.
Where does the Infrastructure Commission fit in all of this with the Infrastructure Bank? Because don't they also advise on
You want to
projects?
ask that one?
Yeah, so as the Judith outlined in her opening remarks, the Infrastructure Bank's about the doing and about the financing and about the expertise to get that financing right. The Infrastructure Commission is about long-term planning and providing expertise on exactly what we should be building and doing, 10, 20 and 30-year projections about the future of New Zealand, the future of our cities and the infrastructure needed to support growth all around the country. And so, look, we supported the establishment of the Infrastructure Commission alongside the government. I think it'd be fair to say it's early days in the Infrastructure Commission's existence. Hasn't quite got many runs on the board, but we think the idea and the concept is a good one. If we're elected to government in October, we'll want to make the Infrastructure Commission work.
Further to that, could you use an example? Could you use a project as an example of how that partnership between the Commission and the bank would work?
Well, take the area that we've been talking a lot about recently, which is building infrastructure in Auckland, transport infrastructure in particular, the long-term development of the Auckland Metro Rail network, for example, or building a 4-lane highway between Auckland and Northland, completing the work that we already undertook in the last government. That is something that's a 10 to 20 year project. We've been upfront about the fact that we've outlined a 20-year program to connect up a 4-lane expressway between Auckland, Hamilton, Tauranga and Northland. That is something that you would want to go to the Infrastructure Commission on for expertise about the scoping of how, exactly when you do each particular bit and some of the land use changes that will drive. And you would be talking to the bank about the right way of financing that over time. We've been upfront about the fact that we could use tolls on that expressway, particularly through the Brynderwyns and through the Kaimais, and so you'd be talking to the bank about the right partnerships that they might want to develop and the right mix of capital that the Crown might want to deploy. So we see the two working hand in glove and of course driven centrally by the government.
I'm not sure who's best placed to answer this, but you're going to be amalgamating a whole bunch of elements of Crown agencies. How many jobs would be up for restructure?
Oh, well, what do you want me to?
Yes, you answer.
Yeah. We've got this odd situation at the moment where you've got very disparate Crown agencies all doing various borrowing programs. You've got Crown Irrigation, you've got this new green investment bank that James Shaw's set up, hasn't actually done much yet, but he set it up, so it sounds good. And you've got MB, of course, which is doing the Provincial Growth Fund loans. And so one of the benefits that we see of bringing them all together is just amalgamation and bringing some discipline into what's a pretty odd mix at the moment with different objectives and different funds. So we see that as a benefit, but we don't envisage huge number of job losses across the civil service and the Crown agencies. It's about bringing them together. And as Judith has said, it's about actually bringing in some expertise from outside the civil service and Crown agencies at the moment, because the Crown needs the best minds with commercial knowledge and nous to make sure that we drive the best outcomes for New Zealanders. And we're upfront about the fact that there's a real need for the Crown to hire those people. So it's not about slashing and burning in the state sector. It's about driving the best outcomes from a commercial point of view for the Crown.
But just for the knowledge of those employees, say how many ballpark would be affected to move into a new building or whatever?
Oh, well, we're not putting a figure on that. It's not something that we're focused on. We're focused on the right outcomes for New Zealanders and bringing all of the disparate different funds and Crown borrowing that goes on at the moment into one agency.